ghosts of D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy, France witnessed one of the most brutal and decisive battles in human history. Over 156,000 Allied soldiers stormed 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of heavily fortified French coastline. The operation, codenamed D-Day, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's grip on Europe. But the cost, the terrible, devastating cost, would scar that coastline forever. Thousands of young men, most barely out of their teens, charged across those sandy beaches under relentless machine gun fire. Many never made it past the water's edge. The surf ran red with blood that morning, and the sand became a graveyard for heroes who would never see home again, never hold their sweethearts, never meet the children they dreamed of raising. The Germans had spent years turning this coastline into what they called the Atlantic Wall, an impregnable fortress of concrete and steel. Bunkers bristled with artillery pieces. Machine gun nests commanded perfect killing fields, with overlapping fields of fire. Mortar positions rained death from above. When the first wave of Allied soldiers hit those beaches at dawn, they walked straight into hell itself. At Omaha Beach alone, over 2,400 American troops were killed, wounded, or went missing in a single day. The carnage was so intense, so utterly overwhelming, that commanders seriously considered abandoning the entire operation. Bodies piled up like driftwood along the shoreline. The screams of the dying mixed with the thunder of artillery and the crash of waves against blood-soaked sand. It was a symphony of horror that would echo through time itself, perhaps more literally than anyone could have imagined. Among those thousands was a young man named Private Marcus Webb. He was just 19 years old, a farm boy from Iowa, with sun-bleached hair and calloused hands that had known nothing but honest work until the day he enlisted. In the pre-dawn darkness of that fateful morning, Marcus huddled in a landing craft with dozens of other terrified young men, the small boat pitching and rolling on the rough channel waters. The air reeked of salt spray, diesel fuel, and vomit. Most of the men had been sick during the crossing. Marcus kept his right hand pressed against his helmet, feeling the photograph tucked inside Sarah, his sweetheart back home, smiling at him from that creased square of paper. Her last letter had promised to wait for him, no matter how long this war lasted. He'd read it so many times the paper had grown soft as cloth. In his mind, he composed another letter to her, one he'd write as soon as they secured the beach. Dear Sarah, you won't believe what we've been through, but we made it. We actually made it. Beside Marcus sat Sergeant Thomas Riley, a hardened veteran of the North Africa campaign. At 26, Riley seemed ancient to the teenagers around him. His face was weathered beyond his years, and his eyes had seen things that gave him nightmares. But now, in the darkness of the landing craft, those hard eyes were closed, his lips moving in silent prayer, the same prayers he'd learned as a child in a Boston tenement, prayers his Irish mother had taught him at her knee. Hail Mary, full of grace, over and over, like a lifeline connecting him to something beyond this floating coffin of steel. Riley had taken Marcus under his wing during training, recognizing the raw fear in the farm boy's eyes. Stay close to me, kid, he'd said more than once. Do what I do, go where I go, and maybe, just maybe, we'll both live to tell our grandkids about this someday. Then, at 6:30 a.m., the ramp dropped. The world exploded into a nightmare of steel and fire. The German MG-42 machine guns opened up immediately with a sound like tearing canvas, a mechanical scream that cut through flesh and bone with ruthless efficiency. Marcus watched, frozen in horror, as the man directly in front of him, a kid from Tennessee, who'd shown everyone pictures of his newborn daughter just yesterday, simply came apart. His body jerked like a puppet with cut strings, spraying blood across Marcus's face before collapsing into the blood-red surf. Move! 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 Sergeant Riley was screaming, shoving men forward, trying to get them out of the fatal bottleneck of the landing craft. But Riley only made it 3 steps into the water before a mortar blast lifted him off his feet and slammed him against the landing craft's side with a sickening crunch. His body slid down into the water, turning it crimson around him, his eyes still open, still trying to form words that would never come. Marcus stumbled forward in blind panic, the cold water reaching his waist, then his chest. Bodies floated in the shallows all around him, rolling back and forth with each wave like grotesque driftwood. The sand beneath his boots was thick with the dead, and the dying he literally had to climb over his fallen comrades to advance, their blood making everything slick and treacherous. Somehow God alone knew how Marcus made it to a tank obstacle, pressing himself against the cold metal as bullets sparked off the iron inches from his head. Around him, men screamed for their mothers, for medics, for God himself to end their suffering. The boy to his left was crying, clutching his stomach where his intestines were spilling out. The man to his right had no face anymore, just a red ruin where a man had been seconds before. The beach had become a slaughterhouse, an open-air abattoir where young men were butchered wholesale. This was Omaha Beach. This was hell on earth. What historians would later call the longest day seemed to stretch into eternity for those trapped on that killing ground. Every second felt like an hour. Every breath might be your last. Every heartbeat a countdown to oblivion. And perhaps, for some of them, it never ended at all. But here's the thing about places where so much pain and death occurred, where the soil itself is saturated with the blood of thousands, where the final thoughts of dying men soak into the sand like rain. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes the echoes of that terrible day refuse to fade away into comfortable history. Sometimes the dead refuse to leave their posts. And if you talk to the locals around Normandy, the fishermen, the shopkeepers, the old women who sweep their doorsteps at dawn, they'll tell you something strange. They'll tell you something that will make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. They'll tell you that D-Day never really ended. They'll tell you that the battle still rages on those beaches, fought by soldiers who don't know they're dead, or perhaps know it all too well but cannot or will not leave. And they'll tell you that if you walk those beaches at the right time in the right light, you might just see them still fighting, still dying, still trapped in that endless dawn of June 6th. 1944. This is their story. This is our story. This is the truth about the ghosts of D-Day. It started just a few years after the war ended, when the physical scars on the land were still fresh, when you could still find shell casings in the sand and rusted helmets half buried in the dunes. The world was trying to forget, trying to move on, trying to pretend that the horror of June 6th could fade into comfortable memory like any other historical event. But the dead had other plans. The first person to hear them, or at least the first to admit it, was a local shepherd named Philippe Rousseau. In the autumn of 1947, on an evening when the mist rolled in thick from the English Channel, Philippe was tending his small flock near the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. This was where the American Rangers had scaled the cliffs under withering fire, where boys had climbed rope ladders while Germans shot down at them like fish in a barrel. Philippe knew this land intimately. He'd walked these cliff tops his entire life, first as a boy helping his father, now as a man of 43 trying to rebuild after the occupation. The sheep knew the paths, knew where to graze safely away from the crumbling bunkers, and the areas still marked with warnings about unexploded ordnance. The evening was growing late, the sun sinking toward the horizon and painting the mist in shades of amber and blood red. Philippe was counting his flock, making sure none had wandered too close to the cliff edge when he heard it. Voices, men's voices, speaking in English. "Move up! Move up!" The command was urgent, desperate, cut through with raw fear. "Medic! We need a medic here." Another voice, younger, breaking with panic. Philippe's heart hammered in his chest. His first thought was that there were hikers in trouble. Perhaps someone had fallen, been injured on the treacherous rocks below. He ran toward the sound, his boots crunching on the frost-touched grass, his breath coming in white puffs in the cold air. "Hello?" he called out in his broken English. "Where are you? Do you need help?" The voices continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Covering fire! Give me covering fire!" Oh God, I'm hit. "Keep moving! Don't stop!" Philippe reached the cliff edge where the voices seemed loudest. He looked down at the rocks below, looked left and right along the cliff top. Nothing. Just empty fortifications, the wind, and the crash of waves far below. The mist was thicker here, swirling around the concrete bunkers like something alive. But the voices didn't stop. If anything, they grew more frantic as darkness fell completely. The desperate commands, the screams of pain, the sound of men dying, it all continued, a phantom battle raging in the air around him. Philippe could hear it clearly. The bark of orders, the crack of rifle fire that wasn't there, the wet sound of bullets hitting flesh. He stood frozen on that cliff top for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, listening to the ghosts of that terrible day replay their final moments. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sounds faded away into silence, leaving only the wind and the waves and Philippe's own ragged breathing. He gathered his flock and hurried home in the darkness, his mind racing. Should he tell someone? Would they think he was mad? Would they laugh at him, the simple shepherd who claimed to hear phantom soldiers? For 2 weeks, Philippe told no one. But when it happened again, the same desperate voices, the same phantom battle, he knew he couldn't keep silent. He went to Father Bernard at the church in Grand Camp Maisie. The old priest listened to Philippe's story, in the dim quiet of the confessional, his weathered hands folded in his lap. When Philippe finished, there was a long silence. Then Father Bernard spoke, and his words made Philippe's blood run cold. "I've heard them too." The priest's confession came slowly, painfully, like a wound being lanced. For months, he explained, his morning walks to say prayers for the fallen had been interrupted by sounds that shouldn't exist. The rattle of machine gun fire, the whistle of mortars, the screams of dying men. Always at dawn, always near the beaches, always the same terrible symphony. "I've been wrestling with it," Father Bernard admitted, his voice heavy with theological struggle. Are they trapped? Are they suffering in some kind of purgatory? Or, he paused, his eyes distant, or are they trying to tell us something? Trying to make sure we never forget what happened here? The priest had no answers, only questions that haunted him during his prayers. But he made Philippe promise to tell him if it happened again, to document everything. "If God is allowing us to hear them," Father Bernard said, "then perhaps we have a duty to bear witness." And Philippe wasn't alone. As autumn turned to winter, other reports began to surface. The fishermen were the next to notice. Old Jacques Montfort came back to port with a story that made the other men shift uncomfortably. His nets had tangled at a specific spot offshore, about a quarter-mile from Omaha Beach. When he and his son pulled hard to free them, they heard voices, angry voices, shouting in German. "Halt! Verboten!" The words were unmistakable, barked out like military commands. It happened again and again at the same location, as if sentries were still stationed there, still warning intruders away from their posts. Other fishermen confirmed it. That particular patch of water became known as the shouting place, and most boats gave it a wide berth. Then the children started talking. A group of local boys had been playing in one of the concrete bunkers near the beach, the kind of place parents warned them away from, which of course made it irresistible. They came running home with faces pale as chalk, insisting they'd heard breathing in the empty gun chambers. Deep, laboured breathing, like someone wounded and struggling for air. 10-year-old Marie Claudel swore she'd heard footsteps on the metal stairs, the ones that led nowhere now, ending in a wall where a door had once been. Heavy boots, climbing up, 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 then silence. When she'd worked up the courage to look, the stairs were empty. Her parents believed her. Too many others were reporting the same things for it to be childhood imagination or pranks. The stories spread like wildfire through the small coastal towns. In cafes and markets, in churches and schoolyards, people whispered about what they'd heard, what they'd felt, what they couldn't quite explain, but knew to be true. Parents started keeping their children away from the beaches after dark. Fishermen began carrying blessed medals and crosses in their pockets, not as superstition exactly, but as insurance. Just in case. Old Madame Lefebvre, who ran the bakery in Colleville-sur-Mer, started placing small crucifixes in her windows facing the sea. For protection, she told anyone who asked. For them and for us. No one laughed at her. No one called her foolish. because by then there was an unspoken agreement among the people who lived along that cursed stretch of coast. Something unnatural was happening here. The past wasn't staying buried. The dead weren't staying dead. In the taverns at night, over glasses of Calvados and whispered conversations, the locals began to say it out loud. They're still here. The soldiers, the ones who died, they never left. D-Day never ended, not for them. And if you listened carefully on foggy mornings, if you walked the beaches at dawn, or stood near the bunkers at dusk, you could hear it too. The phantom battle, the ghost soldiers. The echoes of that terrible day, playing over and over like a record that couldn't be stopped. The question was no longer whether the hauntings were real. The question was, what did the dead want, and why couldn't they rest? The answers began to come in August of 1954, when a British war widow named Margaret Ashford made the pilgrimage that thousands of grieving families had made before her. But Margaret's journey to Normandy would be different. Margaret would see something that would change everything. She arrived on a grey morning that matched her mood, the kind of day where the sky and sea blurred into one endless stretch of melancholy. Margaret was 42 years old, but she felt ancient, worn down by 9 years of incomplete mourning. She had come to visit the grave of her husband, Lieutenant Charles Ashford of the Green Howards Regiment, who had died leading his men off Gold Beach on June 6, 1944. Charles's body had been lost in the initial chaos, swept out by the tide or buried in the sand. No one knew for certain. It had taken 3 days to identify him, 3 days during which his men had pushed inland while their lieutenant lay broken on the beach where he'd fallen. They'd given him a hero's burial in the British cemetery, but Margaret had never been able to say goodbye. Not properly. Not in a way that brought closure to the gaping wound in her heart. She was staying at a small inn in Arromanches-les-Bains, a modest establishment run by a widow herself, Madame Beaumont. The inn overlooked the remnants of the Mulberry Harbour, those massive concrete caissons that still jutted from the water like broken teeth, monuments to the engineering marvel that had supplied the invasion. Margaret found something fitting about staying within sight of them. They too were remnants. They too refused to sink completely beneath the waves and be forgotten. Madame Beaumont had given her room 7, a small but clean space on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the channel. "You'll have a lovely view," the innkeeper had said in careful English, though something in her eyes suggested she wanted to say more. The first night passed uneventfully. Margaret lay awake most of it, listening to the waves, thinking about Charles, wondering if any part of him remained in this place, or if his soul had moved on to whatever came next. She must have dozed near dawn, because she woke to bright morning sun and the cry of gulls. The second night was different. Margaret woke suddenly at 3:17 a.m. She would remember the exact time because she checked her watch, wondering what had disturbed her. The room was bathed in silver moonlight reflecting off the channel, bright enough to see clearly. And there, standing at the window with his back to her, was a man. He wore a British officer's uniform. Even in silhouette, even from behind, there was something achingly familiar about his posture, the way his shoulders set, the tilt of his head. The way his hands clasped behind his back in that particular stance, Charles had always adopted when he was thinking deeply about something. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. "Charles?" The word came out as barely a whisper, more hope than belief. The figure turned slowly, and Margaret's hope shattered into horror. The face was wrong, so terribly wrong, pale and waxy like a death mask, the skin stretched too tight over the bones. And the eyes, dear God, the eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to stare right through her into some abyss beyond. But the uniform was unmistakable. The insignia of the Green Howards Regiment gleamed in the moonlight, exactly where Charles had worn his, polished even in death. The apparition opened its mouth as if to speak. Margaret leaned forward, desperate to hear what it might say, what message Charles might have for her after 9 years of silence. But instead of words, she heard only the sound of waves crashing against the shore, and beneath that, faint but unmistakable, the distant rattle of gunfire and the screams of dying men. Then the figure turned back toward the window and walked straight through the closed glass, passing through it as if it were nothing more than mist. Margaret saw him for one more second, silhouetted against the moonlit sea, before he vanished completely. She sat frozen in her bed, trembling, unsure if she'd just witnessed something supernatural or if grief had finally driven her mad. She didn't sleep again that night. When the first grey light of dawn finally crept through that terrible window, Margaret threw on her robe and stumbled downstairs, her legs barely supporting her. Madame Beaumont was already up, preparing bread for breakfast. When she saw Margaret's face pale and drawn, eyes red from crying, she simply nodded and poured a cup of strong coffee. "Room 7, the innkeeper said quietly. It wasn't a question. Margaret could only nod, her hands shaking as she wrapped them around the warm cup. "It happens in room 7, Madame Beaumont continued, settling into the chair across from her. "Always British officers. Always standing at the window, looking out to sea." She paused, her weathered face sad. "I think they're still waiting for orders to advance. Still waiting to lead their men inland." The words tumbled out, then years of carefully kept secrets. Other guests had seen the same thing. A colonel from London who checked out at dawn, refusing to explain why. A young lieutenant's widow who'd screamed so loudly she'd woken the entire inn. A war historian who'd spent the rest of the night in the parlour, smoking cigarettes with shaking hands. "Why do you keep renting the room?" Margaret asked. "Why not lock it up?" Madame Beaumont's eyes were distant, looking at something beyond the walls of her small inn. "Because someone needs to witness," she said simply. "Someone needs to see them, to acknowledge that they're still here, that they haven't been forgotten." She looked directly at Margaret. "They died for us. The least we can do is bear witness to their sacrifice." And Margaret wasn't the only one bearing witness. As that summer progressed and word spread through the close-knit community of researchers and veterans' families, a pattern began to emerge that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. American soldiers were being seen most frequently around Omaha and Utah beaches. Witnesses described them crawling across the sand, limping toward objectives long since taken, clutching wounds that would have been instantly fatal. One American tourist swore he'd seen a medic kneeling over an invisible body, his hands moving in the motions of administering aid that could never come. German soldiers appeared in and around the bunkers, particularly at the large fortification at Longues-sur-Mer, grey-uniformed figures manning guns that had been silent for a decade. Visitors reported feeling watched from the firing slits, and photographs sometimes showed shadows in places where no shadows should be. But most disturbing of all were the reports of entire units materializing and dematerializing phantom companies going over the top again and again, locked in an eternal assault that never ended. A French farmer claimed he'd seen an entire squad of paratroopers land in his field at dawn, only to vanish before they hit the ground. A British schoolteacher watched a line of soldiers advance up the beach in perfect formation, then simply fade away like morning mist. They were trapped, these ghost soldiers, caught in the worst moment of their lives, forced to relive it over and over. Or perhaps, and this thought chilled Margaret even more, they'd chosen to stay. Chosen to remain at their posts, to continue the mission even death couldn't end. Margaret stayed one more night in room 7, hoping, praying that Charles would appear again. She wanted to tell him she loved him, that she'd never forgotten, that their brief marriage had been the happiest time of her life. She wanted to see him one more time, even knowing what she'd see. But the room remained empty. There was only the sound of waves against the shore and the distant cry of gulls. No figure at the window, no ghost in a green Howard's uniform. Yet somehow, as Margaret left Arromanches the next morning, she felt a strange sense of peace, because now she knew Charles was still out there, still standing watch over the beach where he'd fallen, still leading his men, still trying to complete the mission. He hadn't left her. He'd simply never been able to come home. And perhaps that was its own kind of faithfulness, a love that transcended death itself, a duty that even the grave couldn't end. By 1958, the hauntings were no longer just whispers and shadows. They were becoming physical, tangible, undeniable. And nowhere was this more evident than at the Hotel Moreau, a modest establishment near Utah Beach where something was demanding to be heard. Jean Moreau was not a man who believed in ghost nonsense. At 53, he was practical to his core, a veteran of the First World War, who had rebuilt his family's hotel after the Germans had used it as a headquarters during the occupation. He dealt in facts: occupancy rates, linen inventories, whether the plumbing worked and the roof didn't leak. Ghosts were for old wives' tales and children's nightmares, not for serious men trying to run a business. But his guests kept complaining about room 12. It started in the spring. An American couple on their honeymoon had checked out at 2 a.m, their faces pale, refusing to explain beyond muttered apologies and a hurried departure. Jean had chalked it up to newlywed dramatics and thought nothing more of it. Then a French businessman from Paris complained that someone had been pounding on his door at 3 a.m. When he'd opened it, angry and ready to give whoever it was a piece of his mind, the hallway was empty. "But I heard it," the man insisted, his hands shaking as he settled his bill at dawn. Someone was out there screaming for a medic. An elderly woman who'd survived the occupation reported seeing wet boot prints in the hallway, leading directly to her door, then stopping. Just stopping, as if whoever made them had simply ceased to exist. When Jean investigated, the carpet was bone dry. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Always room 12. Always at 3 a.m, give or take a few minutes. Always the same desperate cries for help, the pounding, the sense of someone in terrible pain trying to reach the living. Jean's wife, Colette, suggested they stop renting the room. "Just tell people it needs repairs," she said. "We don't need the money that badly." But Jean's pride wouldn't allow it. This was his hotel, built by his grandfather's hands. He wasn't going to let superstitious nonsense dictate how he ran his business. There was a rational explanation for everything, and he was going to find it. So on a cool October evening, Jean Moreau decided to spend the night in room 12 himself. "I'll prove there's nothing," he announced to Colette, who watched him with worried eyes as he carried his bedding down the hallway. He set himself up at 10 p.m. with a book, a thermos of coffee, and a flashlight within easy reach. The room was perfectly ordinary: a double bed with a quilted coverlet, a small desk and chair, wallpaper with faded roses, a window overlooking the beach where American soldiers had poured ashore 14 years earlier. Jean read for an hour, drank his coffee, and finally turned off the lamp around midnight. Sleep came easier than he'd expected. Perhaps it was the sound of the waves, or the simple exhaustion of a man who worked 16-hour days. Whatever the reason, Jean drifted off with his book open on his chest. At 3:17 a.m, he jolted awake. The voice was so close it seemed to be right beside his ear, weak, desperate, speaking in English with an unmistakable American accent. "Help me, please, help me, my leg." Jean fumbled for the flashlight, his heart hammering. The beam swept across the empty room, illuminating nothing but furniture and shadows, but the voice continued, growing more urgent. "Help me, God, please, someone help me, my leg." Jean threw off the covers and began searching. He checked under the bed, in the wardrobe, behind the curtains. He pressed his ear to the walls, thinking perhaps sound was carrying from another room. But room 11 was empty, he checked earlier, and the voice wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the room itself, from the air, from everywhere and nowhere. "My leg. I can't feel my leg." Jean ran into the hallway, checking the other rooms, the stairs, even the small basement where they stored extra linens. The voice followed him, growing weaker, fading like a radio signal losing strength. "Please, someone help." He stood in the middle of his empty hotel at 3, 30 inches the morning, flashlight in his shaking hand, listening to a wounded American soldier beg for help that would never come. The voice grew softer and softer until it finally faded to silence, leaving only the sound of Jean's own ragged breathing and the distant crash of waves. Jean didn't sleep again that night. He sat in room 12's single chair, flashlight clutched in his lap, waiting for dawn like a prisoner waiting for reprieve. His mind raced through every rational explanation he could think of: pipes, wind, imagination, stress, anything but the truth that was forcing itself upon him like a weight on his chest. When morning light finally crept through the window, Jean stood to leave, his body stiff from sitting motionless for hours. That's when he saw it. There, pressed into the carpet beside the bed exactly where the voice had seemed to originate, was the perfect outline of a combat boot. Not just an impression or a vague mark, but a complete detailed print. The treads, the heel, the worn pattern of military-issue footwear. Jean knelt beside it, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch it. The carpet was damp, cold and damp, as if someone had just stepped out of seawater. And there, mixed with the moisture, were darker stains that Jean recognized from his time in the trenches of the Great War. Blood. He grabbed his camera, a luxury he'd bought to photograph the hotel for advertisements, and took picture after picture, his hands shaking so badly the first few were blurred. He needed evidence, proof. Something to show that he wasn't losing his mind, that what he'd experienced was real. As the photographs developed in his makeshift darkroom, Jean Moreau's carefully constructed worldview shattered like glass. There it was in black and white, the boot print, impossibly clear, undeniably real, in the carpet of a room that had been empty except for him. "They're real," he whispered to the photograph spread before him. "God help us all, they're real." Colette found him there an hour later, staring at the images with tears running down his weathered face. She'd known the truth already. Women always seemed to know these things before men accepted them, but she held him anyway while he wept. Jean Moreau refused to rent room 12 after that night. He locked it, told guests it was under renovation indefinitely. Some nights, when the hotel was quiet and the moon was high, he would stand outside that locked door and listen. And sometimes not every night, but often enough, he would hear it again. That weak, desperate voice calling from beyond the veil between life and death. "Help me, please, my leg." A soldier who dragged himself off Utah Beach with a shattered leg, who'd made it this far before death claimed him. A boy who'd bled out on ground that would later become the foundation of the Hotel Moreau, whose final moments echoed through time like a prayer that could never be answered. Jean kept the photographs in a locked drawer. He never showed them to guests, never spoke publicly about what he'd experienced. But the other hotel owners along the coast, they all knew. Because by 1958, every one of them had a room like room 12, a room where the dead came to seek help that the living could never provide. The evidence was mounting. The hauntings weren't just stories anymore. They were leaving traces in the physical world, footprints and voices, cold spots and unexplained photographs. The ghosts of D-Day were making themselves known, one desperate cry for help at a time. And there was nothing anyone could do but listen, and remember, and bear witness to suffering that refused to end. The hauntings weren't confined to land. In 1963, the mystery would plunge deeper literally, when a marine biologist discovered that the dead were leaving messages in places the living rarely ventured. Dr. Antoine Girard was not a man prone to flights of fancy. At 38, he was a respected researcher from the Sorbonne, conducting a routine study of coastal erosion patterns along the Normandy beaches. His diving team had spent weeks mapping the underwater topography, taking samples, documenting how 19 years of tides had reshaped the ocean floor where thousands had died. On a grey morning in late September, Girard and his assistant, Michel Beaufort, were working the waters off Omaha Beach. 30 feet down in murky water with poor visibility, they nearly swam past it, a Sherman tank, its hull breached and half buried in sand, listing at an awkward angle like a metal tomb. Wrecks like this weren't uncommon. The ocean floor here was littered with the debris of war, vehicles, weapons, unexploded ordnance, and bones that the sea had long since scattered. This tank should have been just another empty ruin, cleaned out by salvagers or filled with sand and marine life. But when Girard shone his underwater lamp through the breach in the hull, what he saw made him freeze. The interior wasn't empty, and it wasn't natural. Personal effects had been arranged with obvious, deliberate care on what remained of the tank's surfaces. Photographs were positioned on the walls, somehow protected from the water. Letters were sealed in what appeared to be waterproof materials, placed like offerings in a shrine. Dog tags hung from protruding metal, swaying gently in the current like wind chimes in a temple. Michel tapped Girard's shoulder, and made hand signals. "What is this?" Gerard shook his head, unable to answer. Through his mask, he studied the impossible scene. Every instinct, every year of marine biology training told him this couldn't exist. The currents here were strong and unpredictable. Anything loose should have been scattered decades ago, washed out to sea, or buried in sediment. Yet here were photographs, clear and positioned as if someone had placed them just yesterday. He swam closer, his lamp illuminating a picture of a young woman holding a baby. Another showed two men in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. A third was a family portrait: mother, father, 3 children, all arranged with reverence, with love, with purpose. Like a shrine, Michel would later say when they surfaced. Like someone created a memorial down there. But who and how? There was no marine growth on the photographs, no evidence of long submersion. It was as if invisible hands had been tending this underwater monument, preserving it against the ocean's relentless hunger to claim and dissolve all things. Back on the boat, Gerard's hands shook as he developed the photographs he'd taken underwater. The darkroom chemicals worked their magic, and images began to appear on the paper. The tank, the shrine, the impossible arrangement of personal effects. And then Gerard saw something that made him drop the prints, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the background of one photograph, barely visible in the murky water beyond the tank, was the silhouette of a figure, a man in combat gear, watching them work. Gerard grabbed his dive log, frantically reviewing the positions of every team member. Michel had been beside him. Jacques was mapping coordinates 50 meters to the north. Pierre was on the boat. Every diver was accounted for. The figure in the photograph shouldn't exist. But there it was, captured on film, a shadow in the shape of a man, standing where no man could stand, watching from the depths with unknowable intent. Gerard returned the next morning with more equipment and a video camera sealed in a waterproof housing. This time he went alone, leaving his team on the boat with strict instructions to monitor his air supply and depth. He needed to know, needed to understand. As he approached the tank, camera rolling, something happened that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He heard a voice. Not through his radio, the sound cut through the water itself, through his breathing apparatus, resonating in his skull like a whisper in a cathedral. The words were clear, spoken in English with an American accent, heavy with exhaustion and sadness. "Tell them we tried." Gerard froze, suspended in the water, his camera still recording. "Tell them we got as far as we could." The voice was young, so terribly young, filled with the weight of unfulfilled duty and unfinished missions. Gerard wanted to respond, to ask questions, to understand. But his throat was tight, his mind struggling to process what his ears told him was impossible. The voice faded into underwater silence, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the gentle creak of his equipment. The camera had captured it all: the approach to the tank, the shrine inside, and 17 seconds of audio that shouldn't exist. When Gerard presented his findings to colleagues at the university, reactions ranged from skepticism to barely concealed belief. The photographs were examined, the video analysed, the audio enhanced and studied. Some dismissed it as equipment malfunction or natural sounds misinterpreted underwater. Others saw what Gerard saw, evidence of something beyond conventional understanding. His conclusion, stated in a paper that would be quietly filed away and rarely referenced, was both simple and profound. The deceased are not merely haunting these locations. They are actively communicating, creating memorials, leaving messages for the living. They are desperate to be remembered, to have their sacrifice acknowledged. The ocean floor off Omaha Beach has become a shrine maintained by hands we cannot see, voices we should not hear, and a will that death itself cannot extinguish. The dead were curators of their own memory, arranging photographs and letters in impossible places, speaking across the barrier between life and death with a simple plea: remember us, remember what we did, remember what it cost. And now, thanks to Dr. Antoine Gerard, someone finally was. For decades, the hauntings of Normandy relied on eyewitness testimony accounts, that skeptics could dismiss as imagination, grief, or the power of suggestion. But in 2006, technology would capture what human eyes had been seeing for 60 years, and this time there would be no explaining it away. An American documentary crew had come to film a segment about nocturnal wildlife along the beaches of Normandy. Producer David Chen and his team of 5 had set up an array of night vision and thermal imaging cameras along a quarter-mile stretch of Omaha Beach, hoping to capture footage of seabirds, foxes, and other creatures that emerged after tourists left. They positioned their equipment at sunset, calibrated the motion sensors, and retired to their monitoring station, a rented camper van parked in the lot overlooking the beach. They settled in with coffee and sandwiches, expecting a quiet night of reviewing footage of animals scurrying across the sand. What they captured instead would become the most analysed piece of paranormal evidence in modern history. At 3:47 a.m., every motion sensor along the beach triggered simultaneously. "Jesus, what is that?" David's assistant, Sarah Mitchell, pointed at the monitor showing the live feed. "Are those people?" The thermal imaging cameras showed heat signatures, dozens of them emerging from the surf. Human-shaped forms struggling up the beach toward the seawall, their movements laboured, desperate. But the night vision cameras showed something else, translucent figures, barely visible, like shadows cast by a light source that didn't exist. "Get the handheld camera," David shouted, already running for the door. "Move, move, move." The crew scrambled down to the beach, their portable equipment bouncing as they ran. But when they reached the sand, breathless and searching, there was nothing. Just empty beach, dark water, and the sound of waves rolling in under a starlit sky. "Check the footage," David said quietly, his voice tight. "Tell me the cameras saw what we saw." Back in the van, they huddled around the monitors and reviewed the recording. In stunned silence, they watched the impossible unfold on screen. Dozens of figures, at least 40, maybe more, emerged from the water at 3:47 a.m. and struggled up the beach. The thermal imaging clearly showed human heat signatures, warm bodies moving through cold night air. The night vision cameras captured their translucent forms, detailed enough to see uniforms, helmets, weapons. Some crawled, others limped. A few supported wounded comrades, dragging them toward the seawall. The figures moved in tactical formations, covering each other, pausing to return fire at enemies who weren't there, advancing in short rushes exactly as soldiers would have done under fire. They reached the seawall and took cover behind it, some collapsing, others pressing forward. And then, as the timestamp hit 3:49 a.m., they simply faded away, dissolved like morning mist, leaving the beach as empty as it had been before. "That's exactly where the first wave was pinned down," whispered their historical consultant, Dr. Robert Hayes, a retired Army colonel who specialized in D-Day. His face was pale, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Exactly where they took the heaviest casualties. And the time, June 6th, 1944, H-hour plus 17 minutes. That's when the killing was at its worst. 62 years to the minute." The footage spread through the paranormal research community like wildfire. Experts from universities, military historians, video analysts, and skeptics all examined the 17 minutes of recording. Some looked for evidence of fraud or technical malfunction. Others sought to understand what the cameras had captured. Military historians verified the details with disturbing accuracy. The uniforms were correct for the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions that assaulted Omaha Beach. The tactical movements matched documented maneuvers. Even the positions where figures fell corresponded to known casualty locations recorded in after-action reports. Skeptics pointed to camera malfunctions, atmospheric anomalies, or mass hallucination, but they couldn't explain why both thermal imaging and night vision captured the same events simultaneously. They couldn't explain the audio. The faint sounds of waves were punctuated by distant explosions and what sounded like shouted orders, recorded on multiple independent audio tracks. Video experts at 3 different universities analyzed the footage for signs of digital manipulation. All concluded the same thing. If this was a hoax, it was the most sophisticated and expensive one ever created. The thermal signatures alone would require technology that simply didn't exist in consumer equipment. The footage became the most scrutinized paranormal evidence in existence. Documentaries featured it, university courses studied it, believers and skeptics argued over it in academic journals and internet forums. But no explanation satisfied everyone. The footage remained what it was, impossible evidence of something that shouldn't exist. And the 2006 recording wasn't alone. By the late 2000s, the proliferation of digital cameras and smartphones had created an accidental army of ghost hunters. Tourists captured orbs of light invisible to the naked eye, floating across photographs of the beaches. Audio recorders picked up EVP electronic voice phenomena that seemed to be military radio communications from 1944, complete with period-appropriate terminology and call signs verified by military historians. A French teenager, filming a school project on his phone, recorded a translucent figure in an American uniform walking past the camera at the American cemetery, visible for 3 seconds before vanishing. A British couple's vacation video showed shadows moving across the sand at Utah Beach when no physical objects were present to cast them. The pattern was consistent across years, across equipment types, across hundreds of witnesses. Different cameras, different people, different times, but always the same phenomena. Technology wasn't explaining the hauntings away. If anything, it was confirming them, documenting them, providing evidence that was increasingly difficult to dismiss. The locals watched this technological validation with a mixture of vindication and sorrow. They had known the truth for 60 years. They had lived with it, adapted to it, respected it. Now the rest of the world was finally catching up, armed with night vision cameras and thermal imaging and digital audio recorders that captured what the living had always sensed but couldn't prove. The dead were still there, still fighting their eternal battle, still carrying out their mission. And now, finally, the world had evidence that couldn't be ignored. But evidence alone doesn't reveal meaning. Technology can capture the phenomenon, but it takes a human heart to understand the why. That understanding came in 2019, on a quiet evening when a tourist received a message that would finally make sense of 75 years of hauntings. Robert Chen was a Chinese-American architect from San Francisco, visiting Normandy with his wife on their 20th anniversary. He stood on Omaha Beach at sunset, photographing the golden light spilling across the water, when he noticed an elderly man sitting alone on the seawall. The man wore an old American uniform, faded but unmistakable. His posture was weary, his gaze fixed on the ocean as if searching for something just beyond the horizon. Robert assumed he was a veteran, one of the few remaining, returned to remember fallen brothers. He approached respectfully, camera lowered. "Excuse me, sir. Thank you for your service." The old soldier turned to look at him, and Robert found himself staring into eyes that held infinite sadness, an ocean of grief deeper than the channel itself. "I've been waiting," the man said quietly. "We've all been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Robert asked. "Not for thanks." The soldier's voice was distant, hollow. "For understanding." "Understanding what?" "What we left here." The old man gestured at the beach, the water, the sand that had drunk the blood of thousands. "What did you leave?" Robert found himself asking, drawn into the conversation despite a growing chill running down his spine. "Everything." The soldier's eyes never left the ocean. "Our youth, our futures, our very souls. This sand drank us up, and it won't let us go." He paused, and something like a sad smile crossed his weathered face. "But maybe that's right. Maybe that's how it should be." "Why?" Robert whispered. "Because someone needs to remember what freedom costs, the price paid here. The day people forget, the day they take it for granted, is the day they'll have to pay that price all over again." The soldier finally looked directly at Robert. "We stay so you remember, so you never forget. So the sacrifice means something." Robert turned to call his wife, wanting her to hear this, to meet this remarkable veteran. "May, come here, there's someone—" But when he looked back, the seawall was empty. The old soldier had vanished as if he'd never been there. No footprints in the sand, no figure walking away in the fading light, just empty concrete and the sound of waves. On the seawall where the man had been sitting, something glinted in the dying light. Robert walked over, his heart pounding, and picked it up with trembling hands. A dog tag. Corroded, weathered, barely readable, but the inscription was still there, etched into metal that had somehow survived 75 years. PVT Marcus Webb, 116 th Infantry. The farm boy from Iowa, the 19-year-old clutching Sarah's photograph. The soldier who'd watched his sergeant die, who'd scrambled to a tank obstacle, who'd survived the initial assault only to fall somewhere on this beach. Still on duty after 75 years. That night, Robert researched Private Marcus Webb. The records confirmed everything. Killed in action, the 6th of June 1944, Omaha Beach. Body never recovered from the surf. His mother, Sarah Webb, named after Marcus's sweetheart, had waited for letters that never came. She died in 1967, never knowing exactly how or where her son had fallen. And suddenly, Robert understood. They weren't trapped. They weren't suffering. They had chosen to stay chosen, to maintain their post, to bear witness, to serve as living memory of what had been sacrificed here. Not from anger or pain, but from duty and love. A duty that transcended death itself. The hauntings weren't a cry for help. They were a message, delivered over and over to anyone who would listen. Remember us. Remember what we did. Remember what it cost. Remember what you have because of what we gave. Private Marcus Webb had promised to write Sarah from France, and in a way, he had kept that promise. His message had taken 75 years to deliver, carried not by mail but by his own eternal presence. We were here, we gave everything. Don't let it be for nothing. Understanding changed everything. Once the living grasped that the dead weren't threatening but remembering, weren't trapped but serving, the relationship shifted from fear to reverence. Nowhere was this more evident than in how modern-day Normandy learned to coexist with its ghostly guardians. The park rangers at the American Cemetery were the first to openly acknowledge what they'd known privately for years. They learned to recognize the signs: sudden temperature drops in certain sections on warm days, the sound of quiet weeping near specific graves, fresh flowers appearing on headstones where no living visitors had been recorded entering the grounds. Publicly, they said nothing, but among themselves, in quiet conversations over coffee in the maintenance building, they shared stories. They all knew. Every ranger who worked the night shift had experienced it, the sense of being watched, of not being alone during their rounds, not threatening, just present. When Sophie Mercier started as a ranger in 2018, young and eager at 24, her first night shift terrified her. The sounds, the shadows, the overwhelming feeling that the cemetery was full of people she couldn't quite see. Veteran ranger Jacques Moreau, grandson of Jean Moreau, who'd heard the voice in room 1260 years earlier, found her sitting on a bench at 2 a.m., trying to calm her breathing. "They mean no harm," he said gently, sitting beside her. "They're still protecting this place, still standing guard over their brothers." He taught her which sections were most active, how to move respectfully through the cemetery, acknowledging the presence without fear. "Don't be afraid," Jacques told her. "Be honored. Not many people get to walk among such heroes." Sophie learned. Within weeks, she found herself greeting the empty air softly when she entered certain sections. "Good evening. Just making my rounds." Sometimes she swore she felt responses a shift in the air, a sense of acknowledgement, as if invisible sentries were letting her pass. The children learned too. Local schools now taught a special kind of history, not just dates and battles and casualty figures, but respect for the presence that lingered. Teachers explained gently, "If you see soldiers on the beach, don't be frightened. They died for our freedom. Treat them with dignity, as you would treat any hero." 8-year-old Emma Dubois, great-granddaughter of Marie, who'd seen the first ghost in 1952, encountered a group of translucent soldiers near the waterline one morning while walking with her mother. She watched them for a moment, then turned calmly to her mother. "The soldier men are still working, Maman." "Yes, chérie," her mother replied, taking her daughter's hand. "They are. Wave goodbye to them." Emma waved, and perhaps it was a trick of the light, but one of the figures seemed to raise a hand in return before fading into the morning mist. This was the next generation, learning to coexist with the past, carrying forward the covenant between the living and the dead. Every year, on June 6th, thousands gathered at dawn along the beaches for the remembrance ceremony. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the moment the ramps had dropped in 1944, a moment of silence fell over the crowd. And every year, some witnesses reported seeing them, shadows standing at attention among the living, as if the fallen were attending their own memorial. Translucent figures in the crowd, saluting the flags they had died to raise, honoring the ceremony that honored them. Then, as the sun rose fully and light spilled across the water, they would fade away, back to whatever place they inhabited between the world of the living and the world beyond. Their attendance noted, their vigil maintained, their message delivered once more. The people of Normandy had learned to live with their ghosts, not to exorcise them or fear them, but to respect them, to honor them, to ensure that their sacrifice was never forgotten. The dead had chosen to stay, and the living had chosen to remember. It was a covenant written in blood and maintained in reverence and agreement that transcended death itself, binding the past to the present, ensuring that freedom's price would never be forgotten. The truth, once understood, was both simpler and more profound than anyone had imagined. Not all ghosts are trapped. Not all hauntings are prisons. Some spirits choose to remain, bound not by chains but by duty, by love, by a mission that death itself cannot end. The beaches of Normandy are their post. The cemeteries are their barracks. The bunkers and fortifications are their watchtowers. They are not suffering. They are serving eternal sentries, guarding not territory, but memory itself. Each generation needs reminding of what freedom costs. Children grow up taking for granted the liberties purchased with blood. Nations forget the price of peace. The dead know this. They've seen it before, how quickly gratitude turns to indifference, how easily sacrifice fades into dusty history books that students skim without truly understanding. So they remain. They are the living history, refusing to let the world forget. They are the price tag that stays attached, the receipt that never fades, the constant reminder that freedom isn't free and never was. And they are not alone in their vigil. The German soldiers haunt these beaches too. Young men in grey uniforms appear in the bunkers at Lons-sur-Mer, at Pointe du Hoc, in the fortifications they died defending. Most were teenagers, conscripts, boys who'd had no choice in where they fought or why. They too died far from home. They too were someone's son, someone's brother, someone's love. Some encounters show them no longer fighting. A German soldier and an American paratrooper, both translucent, both spectral, standing together on a cliff overlooking the sea, not as enemies, not as combatants, simply as soldiers, sharing a cigarette that produces no smoke, watching over a battlefield where all sides lost something precious. In death, they found common ground. All soldiers, all brothers, all victims of war's terrible machinery. The haunting isn't about victory or defeat anymore. It's about the shared experience of young men sent to kill and die for causes bigger than themselves. The modern world has learned to treat these hauntings with the respect they deserve. No exorcisms are attempted. No priests are called to banish them. No one wants them to leave. They are part of Normandy now, woven into its identity as surely as the beaches and the cliffs and the endless crash of waves. Museums document the encounters alongside the historical artifacts. Hotels embrace their ghostly guests, acknowledging them in quiet ways. Tourism has grown around respectful remembrance. Come walk where heroes walked. They're still here, still teaching us what sacrifice means. Late one night, as this story draws to a close, a single witness walks along Omaha Beach. The moon is high, the tide is out, and the beach stretches empty in silver light. Then, rising from the surf once more, comes an entire phantom unit. Dozens of translucent figures struggling up the sand, exactly as they did 75 years ago, exactly as they will 75 years from now. The leading officer, could it be Marcus Webb, or Sergeant Riley, or any of the thousands who fell here, turns and makes eye contact with the witness. He nods once, a gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude. You see us, you remember. The unit continues up the beach, covering each other, advancing in tactical formations learned in training camps that no longer exist. They reach the seawall where so many fell, where the sand is forever stained with invisible blood. And then, as the first hint of dawn touches the horizon, they fade into morning mist. Mission accomplished, for another night. Until the next witness walks these sands and needs, reminding of what was sacrificed here. The war may have ended in 1945. Victory was declared, treaties were signed, soldiers came home, those who could. But on the beaches of Normandy, the battle continues. Not a battle of bullets and blood anymore, not a fight for territory or strategic objectives. It's a battle for memory, a war against forgetting, a campaign to ensure that the price of freedom is never taken for granted. The ghosts of D-Day remain on duty, eternal sentries guarding not the beaches themselves, but the truth of what happened here. They are the keepers of memory, the witnesses who refuse to fade, the voices crying out across time, remember us. Remember what we gave. Remember what you have because of what we lost. They paid the price of liberty in full on June 6, 1944, and they continue to collect interest on that payment, one haunted night at a time, one witness at a time, one generation at a time. So if you walk these beaches, do so with reverence. If you hear voices in the mist, or see shadows where no shadows should be, do not be afraid. Acknowledge them, thank them, remember them. Because they are still here, still watching, still serving, and they will remain until the last person who values freedom walks these sands and understands what it cost. Lest we forget. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the haunted shores of Normandy. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about the price of the freedom we enjoy, then perhaps the ghosts have accomplished their mission once more. Remember them, honor them, and never ever forget what they gave so that we might live free. Bye, and may their eternal watch bring us wisdom.